Hollywood loves the idea of instant success. We like to believe stars are born in one lucky moment, discovered, celebrated, and lifted into fame overnight. But Clint Eastwood's story is the opposite of that fantasy. It begins not with applause or opportunity, but with a quiet rejection in a small office where someone with authority decided they could predict a man's future. In 1955, Clint Eastwood was 25 years old, sitting across from a studio executive who was explaining why his contract would not be renewed. Clint had spent months doing everything the system asked of him. He took the classes, he showed up early, he accepted tiny background roles. He worked for little money and waited patiently for his chance. And now, politely and firmly, he was being told that chance was over. The executive didn't raise his voice. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't angry. He spoke with the calm confidence of someone who believed they were doing Clint a favor. He explained that Clint's appearance didn't work for the screen. He said his height made him awkward on camera. He said his voice was too soft and rough at the same time. He said Clint didn't have the natural magnetism people wanted in a leading man. And finally, he said the part that stayed with Clint the longest, that he simply didn't have what it takes. Clint didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He listened quietly, nodded, thanked the man for his time, stood up, and walked out of the building. He left with a small amount of savings, no job, and no clear future. But he also left with something else. A deep, quiet refusal to accept that one person's judgment could define the rest of his life. For a while, those words followed him. They showed up when he worked odd jobs just to survive. They followed him into auditions that went nowhere. They stayed with him during long periods when nothing seemed to move forward. But instead of crushing him, those words slowly hardened into something else, a private determination to prove that verdict wrong. Clint didn't chase approval from the same system that rejected him. He didn't wait for permission. He took what work he could find and kept learning on his own. He accepted small roles in television, not because it was glamorous, but because it was available. And slowly, his presence started to register. What once seemed like flaws began to turn into strengths. His height made him impossible to ignore. His quiet voice made people listen more closely. His stillness on screen created tension instead of emptiness. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He didn't beg for attention. And that difference made him stand out. Then came the westerns filmed in Europe. Low budget, rough, and completely outside Hollywood's control. In those films, Clint's restrained style became the point. His silence felt dangerous. His stare felt heavy. His movements felt deliberate. The camera that once didn't respond to him now couldn't let go of him. By the time those films reached American theaters, Clint Eastwood wasn't just successful, he was unavoidable. He became one of the biggest box office draws in the world. Studios that once ignored him now wanted him desperately. The same system that dismissed him now needed him. 15 years after he was let go, Clint was invited back to the very studio that once told him he had no future. This time, the meeting wasn't about whether he was good enough. It was about how much they would have to offer to get him. The room was filled with powerful people. Big names, big promises, big money. And among them sat the same executive who had once told Clint he should give up. Clint listened politely as the offer was presented. Then, before discussing any business, he calmly brought up the past. He reminded the man what had been said. He repeated the judgments, the doubts, the certainty that he would never succeed. The room went quiet. The executive tried to soften it. Time had passed. Mistakes were made. The industry had changed. Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult him. He simply said that the judgments were wrong, all of them, and that his entire career now stood as proof. Then Clint explained something that stunned everyone in the room. Being fired wasn't the part that stayed with him. That was business. What stayed with him was being told he was fundamentally not enough as a person. That kind of judgment sticks. That kind of judgment shapes people. And then he declined the offer. Not because it wasn't generous, not because it wasn't powerful, But because he no longer needed validation from the place that once tried to erase him, he stood up, thanked them for their time, and walked out again, not as a rejected actor this time, but as a man who had outgrown the room. Later, people would call it revenge. But Clint never did. To him, it wasn't about punishment. It was about self-respect. It was about refusing to place your worth in the hands of people who were wrong about you. And that is what made the moment so powerful. Not that he returned successful, not that he confronted someone who doubted him, but that he didn't need anything from them anymore. That's not revenge. That's freedom. The story didn't end when Clint walked out of that room. In many ways, that was only the point where it finally became complete. From that moment on, he no longer had to measure himself against anyone else's expectations. He was no longer reacting to rejection. He was building on his own terms. He went on to make films that defined entire genres, characters that barely spoke but said everything, heroes that weren't shiny or perfect, but steady, controlled, and human. His presence became a language of its own. You didn't watch Clint Eastwood to see what he would say. You watched to see what he would not say. As a director, he brought the same restraint. He trusted silence. He trusted the audience. He trusted the moment. He didn't rush emotion. He didn't decorate it. He let it exist. That patience became his signature, just like his voice, his height, and his stillness once had. Over time, he collected awards, respect, and influence. But more importantly, he collected ownership. He didn't belong to any studio. He didn't need permission. He didn't need protection. He had become self-sufficient in an industry built on control. The man who once judged him became a footnote, not because Clint attacked him, but because time did. History has a way of shrinking the people who try to limit others and enlarging the people who refuse to accept those limits. Years later, when asked about that early rejection, Clint didn't sound bitter. He didn't sound angry. He sounded calm, almost grateful. He said that being told no forced him to rely on himself instead of approval. It forced him to build something real instead of something acceptable. And that may be the quiet lesson inside this story. Not that doubt makes you stronger, not that rejection is good, but that sometimes being misunderstood is what frees you. Because when nobody expects anything from you, you are finally free to become exactly what you are. Clint Eastwood was never wrong for Hollywood. Hollywood was just too small for who he was going to become. What makes this story stay with people is not the success. Hollywood is full of successful people. What makes this story stay is the quiet contrast between how someone was seen and who they actually became. Because when that executive looked at Clint, he didn't see potential, he saw deviation. He compared Clint to a template that already existed in his head and found him incompatible. That is how most misjudgments happen. Not because someone is bad, but because they are different. Clint didn't fit the shape of the era's heroes. He wasn't charming in the traditional way. He wasn't playful. He wasn't theatrical. He didn't perform emotions outwardly. He held them inward. That didn't make him empty. It made him dense. Every movement meant something. Every pause meant something. Every silence had weight. But that only becomes visible when someone stops trying to fit and starts becoming. And that takes time. Most people don't fail because they lack talent. They fail because they give up while they are still invisible. Clint survived the invisible years. He survived the years when nobody watched, the years when nobody praised, the years when nothing proved him right. Those years are where most stories end. His continued. And when success finally arrived, it didn't arrive as noise. It arrived as inevitability. People didn't suddenly fall in love with him. They slowly realized he had been there all along. That shift is powerful. It's the moment when the world catches up to someone who never stopped moving forward. That is why the meeting years later felt heavy. Not because of anger, but because of contrast. Two men in the same room, 15 years apart in trajectory. One had been certain, the other had been patient. Certainty is loud. Patience is quiet. And time listens to patience. That executive believed his authority meant accuracy. Clint believed time would reveal the truth. Only one of them was right. And maybe that is the deepest message in this entire story. Not that you should ignore criticism, not that you should reject feedback, but that you should be careful whose voice you let become the narrator of your life. Because some people speak from knowledge, and some people speak from habit. Some people see you, and some people only see what they already understand. Clint Eastwood didn't defeat his doubter, he outgrew him, and that is always the most complete kind of victory. There is something uncomfortable about stories like this, because they quietly expose how fragile authority really is. The executive believed his opinion was a verdict. He believed his position gave his words weight, and in that moment, they did. They affected Clint. They lingered. They hurt. But authority is temporary. Time is not. Time tests everything. It tests confidence. It tests assumptions. It tests predictions. It tests the stories people tell themselves about who belongs and who doesn't. And over time, only what is real survives. Clint's strength was not that he ignored doubt. It's that he didn't let doubt choose his direction. He listened, absorbed, and then quietly kept walking forward. That ability to keep moving without applause is rare. Most people need reinforcement. Most people need confirmation. Most people need someone else to say, yes, you're on the right path. Clint didn't get that, so he became his own confirmation. That is not glamorous. That is lonely. That is slow. That is uncertain. But it is powerful. When people talk about resilience, they imagine dramatic moments, standing ovations, heroic speeches, big emotional turning points. But real resilience is boring. It's showing up again when nothing changes. It's trying again when nobody notices. It's continuing without feedback. Clint did that for years, not in a visible way, not in a storybook way, but in a human way. He kept practicing. He kept adjusting. He kept learning. He kept accepting that progress doesn't announce itself, and when it finally did become visible, it looked effortless to everyone else. That is always the illusion. People think success arrives suddenly because they weren't watching during the quiet years. They only see the wave, not the tide. They only see the arrival, not the journey. They only see the confidence, not the uncertainty. They only see the result, not the refusal to quit. Clint's presence on screen felt powerful because it was earned. It wasn't manufactured. It wasn't polished into place. It was built through time, discomfort, repetition, and survival. That is why it lasted. And that is why when he walked back into that studio years later, the moment carried weight. Not because of what he said, but because of who he had become. His words mattered because his life supported them. Anyone can claim to be right. Few people can return with proof. The executive had been confident. Clint had been consistent. Confidence is loud. Consistency is quiet. But only one of them creates momentum. That meeting wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about resolution. It was about closing a chapter that had been left open for too long. Clint didn't need to punish the man. He didn't need to embarrass him. He didn't need to destroy him. He simply needed to stop carrying the story that had been handed to him. And walking away did that. It wasn't a rejection of Universal. It was a rejection of the old narrative. It was a refusal to continue defining himself through someone else's lens. And that is something far more people need than they realize. Not revenge, not validation, not applause, but authorship, the ability to write your own meaning onto your own life, the ability to decide what matters, the ability to choose which voices you internalize, the ability to let some opinions remain external. The world will always offer you versions of yourself. It will offer you identities. It will offer you limits. It will offer you explanations. It will offer you stories about what you are and what you are not. Some of those stories are useful. Some are lazy. Some are projections. Some are fear. Some are comfort. Some are convenience. And it is your responsibility to choose which ones you accept. Clint accepted the story that required patience. He rejected the story that required surrender. And because of that, his life unfolded differently. Not better, not easier, not faster, but truer. And truth has a gravity that performance never does. That is why people still watch his films decades later. Not because of nostalgia, not because of fame, but because authenticity ages well. It doesn't expire. It doesn't go out of style. It doesn't lose relevance. It becomes deeper with time. Clint Eastwood didn't just build a career. He built alignment between who he was and what he did, between his nature and his work, between his presence and his purpose. That is why the rejection didn't destroy him. It redirected him, not toward success, but toward himself. And sometimes that is the real victory hidden inside disappointment. You lose the thing you thought you wanted. And in doing so, you are forced to discover what you actually need. Clint didn't need a studio. He didn't need approval. He didn't need permission. He needed time. He needed space. He needed room to become. And once he had that, nothing could stop him. Not doubt, not criticism, not authority, not history, not even the industry that once told him he didn't belong, because by then, he didn't belong to it anymore. He had built something larger than belonging. He had built direction. And direction, once chosen, is unstoppable. If this story meant something to you, pass it on to someone who needs to hear it. There are more people walking around with someone else's limits inside their head than we realize. And maybe it's time to drop those limits. And if you've ever proven someone wrong who didn't believe in you, tell us about it. Your story matters. Subscribe if you want more real stories like this, about people who didn't succeed despite being doubted, but because they refused to let that doubt define them.